Got it.
Hi everyone, welcome back to the History in 20 podcast, and today I've got a very special guest with me. You can see Mr. Mock O'Keefe here, who you might know better on social media as the gay Aristo. He's an excellent guy, fellow historian, and I am going to call you a historian because you are. You are a historian. You're great at what you do.
Thank you.
Um, More than qualified to be so. And a great fact about Mock is he lives in a baby castle in Wales, which is awesome, I think. So I've actually got a guy who lives in a castle, in an actual castle, on the podcast with me. So who better to discuss 5 key LGBT plus figures through history than Mock himself? Welcome to the podcast, Mock.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here. As you said, I'm in my what I call baby castle. Country Life called it a baby castle. It's an Elizabethan building originally, an Elizabethan hall, Hall house. Got to be careful how you say that. With with a Victorian turret, and I'm currently in what is known as the Great Hall. I've joined you here today, and it's freezing. So, one of the things they don't tell you when you own a historic house is just how cold it can be.
And this is the dedication that we expect from all of our guests coming forward. So, to make a start, the first figure, as everyone who's watched this podcast, listened to this podcast, probably knows, I'm a huge Edward II fan. He's even on my historical King's mug I've got here. He's over there somewhere. And Mock and I discussed him on our Instagram Live a while ago. Obviously, one of the most sort of scrutinised kings in English history, largely because a lot of people think he was gay, he was a homosexual king. So, Mock, I'd just like if you could give us a quick overview on Edward II, and particularly a guy called Piers Gaveston. What do we know
Yeah,
about their relationship?
absolutely. Well, I mean, I come to this subject relatively recently. As you know, I'm doing a PhD now in country house studies and focusing on the country house as a refuge for LGBTQ plus people. And I thought I'd write about cushions, or I'd write about, fireplaces or something. But actually, as I started to delve more into history, and particularly the history of castles and great country estates, I realized there are so many LGBTQ plus people. Maybe they wouldn't have turned themselves gay or lesbian or bisexual. Those terms weren't available to them in their day, but people who would say now are part of the LGBTQ plus community. And I think Edward II, probably the good one to start with, the one that, Christopher Marlowe wrote his play about him, lots of rumor and innuendo about Edward II. And we've got an episode on our YouTube channel called Bad Boyfriends Cost Me the Crown. And I think the reason that I'm so drawn to Edward II is because all of us have been in a bad relationship, whether it's a boyfriend or girlfriend, someone in the past, perhaps we had a toxic relationship that had a negative impact on our lives. And I think Edward II made such bad choices in his favorites, which is often, I think, a euphemism for partner, boyfriend, girlfriend, that ultimately it cost him the crown. So, but we didn't always have terrible relationships. You're right. Piers Gaveston was his kind of first true love, his first favorite. And, chroniclers at the time said when they first laid eyes upon each other, they felt such a brotherhood of love together that they were bound only onto each other. So definitely, you've all had it when we've seen someone across the room and fireworks. And I think that's what he had with Piers. Even when he married, in those days, obviously marriages were about strategic alliances with other countries, married, princess from France. Piers carried the crown into Westminster Abbey. He literally held the kingdom in his hands. At the wedding breakfast, it was Piers' family emblems that were up around the room, not France. So he was making a point there. And Piers and him seemed to have a very positive relationship. However, whether it was homophobia or whether it was about having a second king, having another man who had such close access to the king. And, at this time, your pecking order in the court was really important. If you were groom of the stool, you were there at the king's most intimate moment. If you were groom of the bedchamber, you had the chance to have a chat with him, pursue someone's political career, drop something in his ear, whether, as Othello said, pour pestilence in his ear, or make a nod to, you really should think about the Duchess of so-and-so's application. I think she's rather great. And so the barons, the nobles saw Piers as a second king. and potentially didn't like the idea of their king, the monarch, carrying on with a man. You have to understand, in these times, Christian morality was certainly talked about, if not always practiced. The bedrock of society was that kind of Christian principles. And ultimately, if Edward II was sleeping with a man, he was committing a sin. And as Edward was the representation of the country, if he had a sickness, then the country was sick as well. So whether it's around someone else was so close to the king, and we'll talk about his next boyfriend in a moment and how that didn't play out so well, that actually being so close to the king was a threat to the other nobles and barons, or whether it was just homophobia, they were determined to end this relationship and do away with Piers. And what's really sad is Piers was incredibly loyal to Edward. He was off fighting on his behalf in the north. He was captured, and again, not quite clear what happened, but he was killed by the barons. Whether it was, he was killed in self-defense, whether or not they hacked his head off because of his relationship with the king, he was done away with, and that supposedly would end the problem. Get rid of the king's favorite, and then all would be well. But you're not going to change someone overnight simply because they lose a partner. And Edward II did find someone else, the disgraceful and the despicable Hugh de Spencer. And Hugh came as a bit of a double act. He also came with his very strong and overwhelming, very manipulative father. And Edward II, really, this was a toxic relationship. So he basically did whatever Hugh de Spencer and his father said. And Hugh then did carry on to some extent like a second king. He banished nobles that he didn't like. He seized people's land. He took people's money. He even, and this is, I think, incredibly horrible, he even stopped the Queen from seeing her children. So really not a very, very nice man, pretty much a coercive relationship. And the king basically did whatever Hugh and his father said. Now, obviously, the nobles and the barons, again, were up in arms, probably this time quite rightly, that somebody else was basically ruling the country through their king. But the Queen was very clever. She went to pay homage to her brother in France and managed to persuade Edward that the heir to the throne should come with her. And when she was there, she refused to return. Edward, said, come back. Why should she come back to, I don't think people in those days expected love in marriage, but certainly it was a pretty horrific setup for her, denied access to her children, seeing her husband carrying on, even if they were horrific rumors, carrying on with someone else. So what she did is she was a clever strategist. She then, as well as getting into bed literally with one of the barons in France who'd been exiled from England, she raised an army and she invaded the country intent on getting rid of her husband, his favorite, and putting her son on the throne. And she was successful. Hugh and Edward fled to Hugh's lands, just not far from where I live, actually in Wales. They were captured, and Hugh de Spencer was hung, drawn, and quartered, whilst the Queen had dinner. So she certainly, I think, enjoyed that moment. I mean, that is ultimate revenge, really, isn't it, in that?
Yeah.
And her husband, it's still unclear what happened to Edward. He probably just starved to death in a prison cell. However, about 50 years later, this rumor started to circulate that he was impaled on a red-hot poker, and that killed him. And that probably, again, is another example of homophobia, something that is so horrific, making a reference to the sexual act. And again, the last kind of damning way of humiliating the king and making sure that his legend and his history was always tainted. So I've got real empathy. I've had some bad boyfriends in my life. I'm sure we've all had some bad partners. I'm very happily married now, but to a lovely man, Joe. But I think he made bad choices in men, and therefore that ultimately cost him the crown.
Definitely, I completely agree with you, and that was such an interesting overview, and it's a side of the king that we don't often see, because people who might have heard of Edward II just think, oh, weak monarch, he lost at Bannockburn, his father was much better and his son was twice as good. So that's I love seeing that side of
And you've got to understand, where does the legend around weakness come from? I think we might be talking about Queen Anne later on, I'm not sure. But, again, people say she was a weak queen. Actually, she brought Scotland into and created Great Britain. Yeah. Key strategist to do that. Because she was ill, she probably had lupus. She brought key people around her. Sarah Churchill's husband, John, Duke of Marlborough, who got Blenheim Palace as a thank you for defeating the French. She defeated a huge foreign army and created Great Britain. But again, weak queen, because potentially she, had relationships with both Abigail and with Sarah Churchill. Edward II, weak king, because he had same-sex relationships. These stories about weakness, I think, actually, when you look at them, could in fact be homophobia.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that's why I think it's a good point to move to our next king now, our next person who just happens to be a king, is James I of England, because I noticed you did a little feature on him on Instagram not so long ago, which your username is Gay Aristo, if anyone doesn't already follow you. I'll put that on the screen and links and everything. So James was King of England from 1603 to 25, famously targeted in the Gunpowder Plot, Guy Fawkes. But yeah, if you could just tell us a bit about him and why he's included in this list of LGBTQ plus figures, that would be really interesting.
So I think James I of England, or James VI of Scotland, I believe he was. What I think is ironic about him being a king, and I love how history ultimately has its ironies and kind of plays fools with all of us. As flies to wanton men are we to the gods. They kill us for their sport, as King Lear said. His mother was Mary, Queen of Scots, and Elizabeth I was so intent on not having, of the threat of her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, that she first had her, imprisoned up in Hardwicke House. And famously, Bess of Hardwicke used to do her needlework with her until she thought her husband was carrying on with Mary, Queen of Scots, and then had her beheaded. But because the Queen never married, she had no issue, she had no heir. Ultimately, it was her biggest rival's son who took the throne. And I think that in of itself is very interesting. Now, we applaud Elizabeth I for her defeat of the Spanish. We don't applaud Queen Anne for her defeat of the French. We don't really question the fact that the Queen Elizabeth I didn't do her duty by producing an heir to the throne. We just applaud her as a strong monarch. Now, there are some arguments that actually, if she married, that her position, her authority, her strength would be undermined because she would have been the property of her husband. And I get that argument, I really do. But I find it horrific when we say that we criticize Anne and we don't actually criticize Elizabeth, who didn't do her duty. Anne at least tried. She was the last of the Stuart monarchs. She was the last of James's line. However, she did try. I think she had 11 or 15 children. I mean, she really tried. She miscarried, or they were born died in childbirth or very soon afterwards. But anyway, James I. So he is a very interesting, very, very gruff man, not great in public. I think he would have been a really good fun in the pub. He was pretty rough with his language. There was one courtier who was presenting himself, and he gave all these lists about, I'm here and I'm from there and from this. And he went, oh, Jesus, I didn't know you were descended from Adam. And another time, he was, he was out, there was some sort of wonderful parade or whatever, and he was supposed to sit in his box and kind of gently wave at people. And he kind of didn't really fancy it and kind of wandered back inside. And one of the courtiers very politely said, I think, Your Majesty, we should maybe have you out front so that people could see you. And he said, oh, would they like to see my arse too? I mean, he was really pretty gruff man, but a good sense of humor. I think it'd be quite fun on a Friday night down the pub. But yes, he himself, whether or not he was bisexual, whether he was gay, again, those terms wouldn't have been recognized. And actually, it's only kind of in the Victorian days, if you start getting this real linear, 1869, the term homosexual, was invented, was written in a pamphlet for the first time. But he definitely had a very close relationship with Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, the first Duke of Buckingham. And there are some correspondence that remain. Now, interestingly, because of legal discrimination or fear of persecution at the time, often personal letters were destroyed by descendants because they might damage the reputation of their ancestor. They might find out that they were hopping into bed with some people that people might not approve of. So it's quite rare that we have these correspondence between the Duke of Buckingham, George Villiers, and James I. They refer to each other as husband and wife. You know, James I says, I have no joy in this life except for, I'm paraphrasing, but except for when I'm with you. This life is only bearable when I am with you. He talked to his courtiers about Jesus had his John, I have my Duke of Buckingham. And there's an incredible a letter that remains that where George Villiers writes to the king about a night they spent together, when he talks about, you know, even a hare's dog could come between our bedposts. And the king, very excitedly, sort of says, let's do that again. So I think there's definitely, again, some indication there was a real closeness in that relationship. I believe it probably was a physical relationship. But even if it wasn't, if you take the broader idea of a queer relationship, something that's slightly out of the ordinary, that close relationship between those two men is extraordinary. Now, you can excuse it away by saying, oh, language was different in those days, and it was very, you know, people were very florid in their address. They absolutely were, but I don't think men referred to each other as husband and wife. And this is the challenge that we look at on our YouTube channel and on Instagram in Gay Aristo, where we say LGBTQ plus history, the great women and men of history who may have had be part of the LGBTQ plus community, have had their existence almost edited out. And because most of our LGBTQ plus history is a history of criminology and court cases, you have to peer into the cracks of history. You have to look for those unusually close relationships. You have to look at chroniclers at the time and see what they were saying and what they were insinuating. Now, when people talk about the court being full of a bunch of effeminate harlots, they might have been doing that just to kind of run the king down. But why was the court filled with all these pretty boy men? Why did Frederick the Great have, you know, a huge homoerotic art collection, never marry? Why did Leonardo da Vinci call the act of procreation absolutely disgusting and get arrested for supposedly sleeping with one of his male models? You have to look at these little chinks in history and say, what might be going on there? Because you know what? I don't really care if James I was gay. I don't really care whether or not Queen Anne was lesbian, bisexual, whatever. All I care is just about asking the question and making sure that everyone is represented in history.
Absolutely. That's the most inclusive way we can look at things. And I think I mentioned to you as well on this channel, the whole idea of it is that history is inclusive for everyone, every type of person, every race, every gender, every sexuality, anything like that. Anyone has, the people have existed throughout time. It's all about representation. And people,
but history is written by the winners, though. History is written by the winners, and actually traditionally they are white men who are straight. And there is an overarching assumption that the great women and men of history are straight because that fits the narrative. Someone like Casanova, the great seducer of women, for example. Casanova was kicked out of the seminary when he was training to be a priest because he was found in bed with a man. In his life story, Ma Vie, he wrote about 2 same-sex relationships he had. But again, because that doesn't fit the great narrative of history, which the winners have written, it's edited out. And so on the Gay Aristo, I just want to shine a bit of a loving light on that side of history. I don't necessarily take the argument, which I had the other day on a YouTube video when I had some comments where people were saying, well, what do you care about Lord Castlereagh being potentially gay and committing suicide because he is being blackmailed? I care because if you think about, you are in one role for life, like a king or a queen, and people have these expectations of you, but you have feelings that are outside what the narrative is accepted for you in that role. I believe the mental health implications for those individuals would be huge. And if you try and think about these people as humans, as opposed to just the role that they played, think about the humanity of not being able to love the person that you loved and feeling trapped in a role that meant you couldn't be your true, authentic self. And I don't think whether you are rich, whether you are poor, whether you are a monarch, or whether you're a peasant in the field, everyone has a right to live their true, authentic life. No one can doubt that. No matter how rich or how poor you are, if you're rich, not living out your true, authentic life, I imagine it's pretty horrendous.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I absolutely agree, yeah. And the next sort of thing we're going to jump onto, next key figures, are two ladies, actually, and I'm going to get the pronunciation wrong. The ladies of Llangollen, sort of
I
17.
say, yeah, I might not get it right as well. I'm new here in Wales, only
Right,
been here under 2 years. Ladies of Llangollen, I think,
right,
it's because double L is cla in
right.
Wales. And
Okay.
these are two of my favorite historical characters. Again, there's some debate whether or not they were actually lovers. People talk about a romantic friendship. Okay. So Sarah and Eleanor were Irish aristocrats, once described as typical Irish aristocrats in that they were the cream of society, rich and thick, which is a bit of a put down, but I don't think it's necessarily true. But they fell in love when they were very young in Ireland, and they tried to escape twice together, and their families, found them, brought them back. There's stories of one hiding in the wardrobe for 2 days, living in the other's bedroom, all these sorts of things, incredibly close, vowing we'll never get married, we'll be bound into each other for life. Why would you do that if you didn't have, romantic feelings and sexually romantic feelings for this other person? So eventually their families capitulated and said, okay, you don't have to marry so-and-so, the squire down the road. You can leave Kilkenny Castle, but you have to leave the country. So they were banished and forced to leave the country, and they made their way to Wales, just across the water, to Llangollen, up in the north of Wales. And they built a little house. Well, they had a house there, which they renovated over the years, and they called it Plas Newed, which is new place. And I love the idea that they started their new life in a new place. Eventually they became celebrities. They were visited by the royal family. Wordsworth wrote a poem about them. They were celebrated throughout the kingdom. They led parades in their village, and they just lived quietly with a housekeeper together in a very intimate, quiet life, one of love, which is what they wanted. And I was talking about them on my Instagram page on National Girlfriends Day, because I think they're a lovely example of just a committed, quiet relationship. They weren't making any huge political statements. They just loved each other. But I love the fact that they left their riches, they left, their titles, they left the castles behind, and they came to live in a small house in Wales to spend the rest of their life together in loving harmony.
I think it's a brilliant example that you've managed to find these like LGBTQ plus figures from history that aren't just kings and queens. They are just like, yeah, they were from the upper echelons of society, but they were just two ladies who loved each other. That's
Yeah.
it. And I think that's brilliant that in that period, you just don't expect, well, not that you don't expect it, but you don't hear about it. So I
No,
think,
well, I mean, ultimately, the kind of the below the stairs, people out in the rural communities, their lives aren't recorded in the way that perhaps, the local gentry, aristocrats, monarchs' lives are recorded. I would love to find out more about, stable boys and chauffeurs from the 50s and 60s, but there's less recorded about that. There's some stuff in Georgian England about that, and obviously, with Oscar Wilde, I think we'll talk about in a moment, probably, some of the boys that he had relationships with, which are incredibly problematic because of their age. But actually, that's a challenge in history, that we don't have really the history of everyday folk. So my plea to anyone who's listening to this podcast is keep everything. Your own life is a personal archive for historians in the future, whether it's your bill from Asda, whether it's the letter that came from your local church asking you for money for the steeple, whether it's your marriage certificate, your civil partnership certificate, whatever it is, keep it, because we want to make sure that the lives of ordinary people like us are recorded and represented in the future. Yes, it's great that we know all about, Queen Elizabeth II, and history will certainly have a lot to say about Prince Harry, but we should be as interested as in somebody who lives in a semi in Newcastle as somebody who lives in a palace at Windsor.
yeah, I completely agree. And we'll just before you mentioned Oscar Wilde there, just before I move on to him, we've got one more guy. Just before that, I thought we'd cover him. Horace Walpole. What can you tell us about him and his?
Horace Walpole. I tell you what, if I had my time again, Horace, I say Horace is my boyfriend. We're going to get 2 sheep here in our paddock outside. I'm going to call one Horace and one Walpole.
Brilliant.
I've said it out loud. My husband has to agree now. So Horace Walpole was the son of the first Prime Minister of England, Robert Walpole, an incredibly masculine man, lived in Houghton Hall, neoclassical structure, very masculine, you know, really, I'd say an alpha male. And Horace was his youngest son, incredibly effeminate, a man of literature and words. He had very close relationships with men. Right back from an Eton, he had a coterie of men who were around him when he went on his grand tour. He went on a grand tour with Gray, the poet who wrote Elegy in an English churchyard. They had a huge falling out on the grand tour. I think it was a lover's tiff. And Gray disappeared for a while. He was interested in beauty and gossip. His letters are incredibly acerbic, incredibly bitchy. When he met the Chevalier Dion, who presented as a man for the first part of their life, and then in their middle age presented as a woman, was a French spy, swords person, lady in waiting to Marie Antoinette. When the Chevalier met Horace Walpole, Horace was very bitchy about the Chevalier and said the Chevalier's hands were more suited to carrying a chair than a fan. So you get the idea of the kind of person he was. And he built this beautiful Gothic fantasy in Strawberry Hill, just outside London. We've just done an amazing video on it on our YouTube channel, where he brought together all of his men, the company of the aesthetics, he used to call them, Society of the Aesthetics, I think he called them. And they designed this complete Gothic fantasy. Now, he was outed. He was called a finger twirler. He was called effeminate. And in those days, again, you know, you could be punished. You could be put in jail. You could be put to death in some sense. You could be put in the stocks. People used to throw cats at you if you were put in the stocks. I don't quite know why. So he ran away to Strawberry Hill, his country house on the river. And he descended into kind of alcohol and drugs, and got gout, and really was kind of afraid for his life. But there, at Strawberry Hill, he had a vision of a gauntleted hand at the top of the staircase. And this inspired him to write the first Gothic novel, The Castle of Otranto. And without Horace and his high theatrical and high camp outlook on the world, we'd never have Jane Eyre, we'd never have Wuthering Heights, we'd never have Dracula. So absolutely fascinating man, and never married. Surrounded himself with men all his life, lived with men, as I said, was kind of outed by society. But interesting, once The Castle of Otranto was published, he was able to come back into society because he was, incredibly famous again because of this amazing book that he had written. And, you know, if anyone is near London, you should go and check out Strawberry Hill. It's a trust, it's a charity that now maintains the house. They do LGBTQ+ tours as well, so you can go and see all the detail around Horace's life. Or also, you can check out my YouTube channel. There's a lovely video on there about Horace Walpole, and Mark, who's the guide who does the house tours, takes me around on that.
Excellent. I'll make sure to link that video at this part in the podcast episode, so you can go and check that out. It is a good video. I've watched it. It's really good.
And you know what's interesting? Horace, at that point, everyone was into classicism, you know, Doric columns and very masculine. And he chose the complete opposite, this very twirly, this very fancy Gothic. To some extent, it was a rebellion against his father. It was a completely different kind of house. And it wasn't in vogue or in fashion. He thought that it was the true English style, kind of from the medieval times. And he was going back to the true English architecture. It then became incredibly fashionable. And we have things like St. Pancras Station and the Houses of Commons afterwards. But he was completely a trailblazer in the aesthetic of Gothic architecture.
Brilliant. And what a guy, like what a sassy guy as well. So I'm conscious we've only got a few, like sort of 5 or so minutes left. So obviously the last character we want to discuss is the world famous Oscar Wilde, who lived from 1854 to 1900. So what can you tell us about him, and why is he on this list as our final?
So Oscar Wilde, yeah, probably the most famous homosexual in history, although he wouldn't have called it homosexuality, he would have called it Uranian love. Irish, minor aristocrat gentry, came over here and was incredibly successful as a poet, as a playwright, as a writer of short stories. He was the celebrity of his day with his acerbic wit. But he had a dark side. He was married to Constance, had 2 boys, lived in Chelsea, London, but he was gay, and he met Lord Alfred Douglas, the son of Lord Queensberry, and they had a passionate on-off affair for many, many years, but he wasn't in any way quiet or discreet about it. Queensberry left a card for Oscar at his club saying that he was posing as a sodomite. Oscar rather foolishly sued Queensberry. All you have is your reputation. He believed his reputation was being tarnished by Queensberry. He lost. And then he was arrested and tried. And put, after one court case didn't, was thrown out, and the second one, and he was convicted and had 2 years hard labor in Reading jail. The lovely thing is he did kind of meet up with Bosie when he got out of jail, and they spent most of their life together in Italy. There were some other people around him who supported him, but he went from being like as famous as the Kardashians to being a nobody and living on a very, very frugal income. Now, he was rather foolish why he decided to sue Queensberry. It's been interpreted now that he was kind of a martyr for the cause. I think there's an element of ego in there, that he couldn't stand to see his reputation tarnished. He did carry along with a lot of rent boys, a lot of very working class boys, young men that he picked up in Mayfair and Piccadilly. And that is problematic now. A lot of them are 14, 15 years old, very poor. Probably it's abuse. And I think we have to see that as well. We might see on lots of films, Oscar wandering around with a frock coat being very witty. There was a dark side where he abused children. And yes, he had an incredible love with Bosie, again, a very toxic relationship with Bosie. But when we hold him up as the prophet and the champion of homosexuality, there's a dark side to him. And that's why I think we're also still talking about Oscar. Whilst he now has become the champion of the homosexual cause and the martyr, there's also a dark side to him, and light and dark makes history more interesting.
I completely agree with you, and I really respect that as well, that while we're looking at these LGBT figures, it's not all like rose-tinted glasses. We are looking at the real life people, and there are those boys who ultimately did suffer. Yes, Oscar Wilde championed the cause for the greater part, but you've just provided such a balanced side of it there that he did have a dark side as well. I think that's really...
You can't sugarcoat people just because they were LGBTQ. A lot of these people that I talk about on Instagram or YouTube were involved in slavery, were involved in atrocities. James I in Ireland, absolutely abhorrent things that they carried on and that they supported. So we can't, just because they were gay, they shouldn't be given a free pass. We have to understand them in the whole, recognize an element of them was their sexuality, but also recognize some of the injustices and some of the atrocities that they are responsible for. And that, to me, means you're getting true history as opposed to rose-tinted history. Just because you're gay doesn't mean you're not a bad person.
Yeah, I completely agree. So I'd just like to place on record my thanks to Mock for coming on this episode. I hope you enjoy it. Go and check out his channel, all his social medias. They're all linked below. I'll put links in the video as well to certain videos where stuff that's been mentioned is relevant. So thanks for coming on, Mock. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. It's been great to talk to you. Keep doing what you're doing. I love it.
Thank you.